Karen had always dreamed of visiting London, the city she'd seen in countless movies and read about in books. The grandeur of its history, the charm of its streets, and the allure of its famous landmarks called out to her adventurous spirit. Finally, after months of saving and planning, she found herself standing on a sidewalk near Buckingham Palace, surrounded by throngs of tourists, snapping pictures and marveling at the iconic sight before them. The day was crisp, with a gentle breeze carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass from the palace gardens. Karen adjusted her scarf as she looked up at the towering gates of the palace, her heart racing with excitement. She felt like she'd stepped into another world, a place where royalty still reigned supreme and tradition held strong against the rush of modern life. Her friends stood beside her, equally awestruck, their cameras clicking away as they tried to capture every detail of the scene. As Karen wandered closer to the palace forecourt, her attention shifted to the royal guards stationed nearby. Clad in their red tunics and tall bearskin hats, they stood motionless, exuding an air of authority that seemed almost otherworldly. Their stoic expressions never wavered, no matter how many people gathered around or how many jokes were cracked in their presence. To Karen, they looked less like human beings and more like statues brought to life, part of the scenery but untouchable. Her curiosity piqued. Karen leaned toward one of her friends and whispered, "Do you think they ever get tired of standing so still?" Her friend shrugged, grinning. "Probably, but imagine trying to keep a straight face when someone does something ridiculous right in front of you." They both laughed, imagining what it might take to crack the guard's composure. But Karen's amusement didn't stop there. As she studied the guards more closely, her eyes landed on the rifles slung over their shoulders. Polished to perfection, the weapons gleamed under the soft sunlight, adding to the guards' imposing appearance. Yet, instead of feeling intimidated, Karen saw them as props, part of the spectacle that made this experience feel larger than life. She nudged her friend playfully. "What do you think would happen if I grabbed one of those rifles? Like, just for fun." Her tone was light, almost teasing, but her friend hesitated, glancing nervously at the guards. "I don't know," he replied cautiously. "Probably nothing good. Don't even think about it." But Karen wasn't convinced. In her mind, the guards were part of the show, existing solely to entertain visitors like her. Surely they wouldn't mind a little harmless interaction, right? Besides, everyone around her seemed to be having such a good time, posing for photos, laughing, and enjoying the moment. What harm could come from joining in, even if she took things a tiny step further? With a mischievous grin spreading across her face, Karen turned back to the guard nearest to her. He stood ramrod straight, his gaze fixed ahead, as though oblivious to the crowd surrounding him. She couldn't help but admire his dedication to the role, but at the same time, she felt a growing urge to test the limits of his patience. After all, how often did someone get the chance to interact with a real-life royal guard? Little did Karen know, her next move would set off a chain of events far beyond anything she could have imagined. For now, though, she was caught up in the thrill of the moment, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface of her carefree decision. Without giving herself too much time to second-guess her plan, Karen took a deep breath and stepped closer to the guard. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the rush of excitement that came with doing something bold and unexpected. She glanced around quickly, noticing her friends still chatting and laughing nearby. They hadn't noticed what she was about to do yet, which made it all the more thrilling. The guard stood as still as ever, his rifle resting against his shoulder like an extension of himself. To Karen, it looked almost ceremonial, more like a decoration than a real weapon meant for serious use. "It's not even loaded," she thought to herself, brushing aside any lingering doubts. With one final smirk, she reached out and wrapped her hands around the barrel of the rifle, pulling it gently toward her chest. For a split second, nothing happened. The guard didn't move, blink, or even glance in her direction. His face remained completely expressionless, as though he hadn't felt a thing. Karen couldn't help but laugh at how absurd the situation felt. Here she was, holding onto a Royal Guards rifle, while the man himself acted as if nothing unusual was happening. Encouraged by this lack of reaction, she struck a playful pose, pretending to aim the rifle into the distance like a soldier on duty. Her friends noticed immediately and erupted into laughter. One of them shouted, "Karen, you're crazy," while another whipped out their phone to record the moment. Cameras flashed, capturing Karen mid-pose, her grin wide and carefree. For those few seconds, she basked in the attention, soaking up the energy of the crowd around her. It felt like the ultimate souvenir, a story she could tell for years to come. But beneath the surface, things were far from calm. Though the guard showed no outward sign of distress, his training kicked in instantly. Years of preparation had drilled into him the importance of maintaining composure under pressure, no matter how bizarre or unsettling the situation might be. Internally, however, alarms were blaring. Touching a Royal Guard's equipment wasn't just a harmless prank, it was a breach of protocol, a potential threat, and something that required immediate action. With subtle precision, the guard used a series of nearly imperceptible hand signals to alert nearby security personnel. These gestures, practiced countless times during drills, communicated volumes without alerting the oblivious tourists gathered around. Within moments, plainclothes officers stationed nearby began closing in, their movements swift but discreet. To the casual observer, everything seemed normal. But for Karen, who was still caught up in the moment, trouble was already on its way. As she handed the rifle back to the guard, chuckling at her own audacity, Karen failed to notice the shift in the atmosphere. The once relaxed vibe of the forecourt had grown tense, with whispers rippling through the crowd as people realized something wasn't quite right. A few tourists stepped back instinctively, sensing that the fun and games were over. Others continued snapping photos, unaware of the seriousness of the situation unfolding before them. Karen finally turned to rejoin her friends, expecting applause or maybe a little teasing for her daring stunt. Instead, she found herself facing stern expressions and hushed conversations. Before she could ask what was wrong, a voice behind her cut through the air like a knife. "Ma'am, please step away from the guard." Startled, Karen spun around to see two men in suits approaching her, their faces unreadable but undeniably serious. Her stomach dropped as reality began to sink in. What had started as a lighthearted prank was quickly turning into something much bigger and much scarier than she'd anticipated. The voice that called out to Karen was calm but firm, carrying an authority that silenced the chatter around her. She froze mid-step, her smile fading as she turned to face the two men, now standing just a few feet away. Dressed in dark suits, they looked nothing like the cheerful tourists snapping photos nearby. Their eyes were sharp, scanning the scene with a level of focus that made Karen feel like she'd been placed under a microscope. "Ma'am," one of them repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Please step away from the guard." Karen's mind raced. For a moment, she considered laughing it off, thinking maybe they were joking or overreacting. But the look on their faces told her otherwise. These weren't ordinary security guards. They were professionals trained to handle situations exactly like this one. Her heart began to pound harder, not with excitement this time, but with a growing sense of unease. She took a hesitant step back, raising her hand slightly in what she hoped was a non-threatening gesture. I didn't mean anything by it," she stammered, glancing toward her friends for support. But they were too stunned to respond, their cameras lowered and expressions frozen in shock. The playful energy that had filled the air just moments ago had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press down on everyone present. The plainclothes officers exchanged a quick glance before stepping closer. One of them gestured subtly to others positioned strategically around the forecourt. Though Karen couldn't see them clearly, she noticed movement at the edges of her vision. More figures closing in, forming a loose perimeter around her group. It was subtle enough not to alarm the other tourists, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. "You need to come with us," the officer said, his voice low but commanding. He didn't shout or raise his hand, yet there was no mistaking the seriousness of his words. Karen felt her throat tighten as panic started to creep in. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Grabbing the rifle had been a joke, a silly, harmless prank meant to entertain her friends and spice up her vacation memories. How could it have escalated so quickly? Her legs felt heavy as she followed the officer's instructions, each step making her more aware of the gravity of her actions. Tourists who had been oblivious to the tension moments earlier now watched curiously, whispering among themselves. Some pointed discreetly in Karen's direction, while others pulled out their phones to capture the unfolding drama. To them, it was entertainment, an unexpected twist to their day at Buckingham Palace. To Karen, it felt like the world was crumbling beneath her feet. As they led her away from the guard and the crowd, Karen caught sight of the royal guard she'd interacted with. He remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as if nothing had happened. His composure only deepened her embarrassment. Had he known all along that this would happen? Was he silently judging her, or was he simply following protocol? She wanted to apologize, to explain that she hadn't meant any harm, but the words stuck in her throat. The officers guided her toward a side entrance of the palace grounds, far from the main throng of visitors. As they walked, Karen tried to process what was happening. Why were they taking her away? Would she be arrested, fined, or worse? Her imagination spiraled, conjuring images of prison cells and headlines splashed across newspapers. Each thought sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through her body. When they reached a secluded area near a small security booth, the officers stopped and turned to face her. One of them spoke again, his tone softer but still authoritative. "We'll need you to wait here while we assess the situation." Assess the situation. What did that even mean? Karen nodded numbly, unsure of what else to do. The reality of her predicament was sinking in, and it was far darker than anything she'd imagined when she first reached for that rifle. Behind her, the sounds of the palace courtyard faded into the background. The laughter, the clicking cameras, the hum of conversation, all replaced by the cold weight of uncertainty. For the first time in her life, Karen truly understood the difference between harmless fun and crossing a line she hadn't even realized existed. The small security booth where Karen was asked to wait felt suffocating, even though it wasn't much smaller than a typical room. The walls were plain and gray, with no windows to let in natural light. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the space. There was a metal table bolted to the floor in the center of the room, surrounded by two chairs, one occupied by Karen, who sat stiffly on the edge of her seat, and another pulled out for one of the officers questioning her. Karen's mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Just minutes ago, she'd been laughing with her friends, convinced she was pulling off the ultimate tourist prank. Now she was sitting in what felt like an interrogation room, her heart pounding so loudly she swore the officers could hear it. Her palms were clammy, and every time she swallowed, her throat felt dry and tight. The officer seated across from her opened a notebook and clicked his pen, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Let's start from the beginning," he said calmly, though his tone carried an undercurrent of seriousness. "Why did you take hold of the guard's rifle?" Karen hesitated, unsure how to explain something she barely understood herself. I thought it would be funny," she admitted quietly, avoiding eye contact. "It looked like part of the display, you know. Like it didn't seem real. I didn't mean to cause trouble." The officer nodded but didn't soften his expression. "Do you understand why we can't treat this lightly?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. "That rifle is part of the guard's equipment. Even if it isn't loaded, touching it is considered a breach of protocol, and potentially a threat to national security." "National security," Karen repeated, her voice cracking slightly. The phrase sounded absurd in the context of her actions, but the gravity behind it hit her hard. She hadn't thought about the bigger picture, the fact that these guards weren't just there for show. They represented centuries of tradition and stood as protectors of the monarchy itself. In her mind, they'd been props in a tourist attraction. In reality, they were guardians of something far greater. The second officer, who had been standing silently near the door, chimed in. "You're not the first person to try something like this," he said, his tone measured but firm. "But every incident has consequences. We have protocols in place to ensure the safety of everyone here, including you." Karen nodded slowly, trying to process what they were saying. She wanted to argue that her intentions were innocent, that she hadn't meant any harm, but deep down, she knew excuses wouldn't change anything. What mattered now was damage control, and figuring out how bad things might get. After a few more questions, the officers excused themselves, leaving Karen alone in the room. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as she waited, her thoughts spiraling between regret, fear, and disbelief. How had such a simple act turned into such a massive ordeal? Would her family find out? Would her job back home be affected? The weight of the unknown pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Eventually, the officers returned, accompanied by someone wearing a uniform adorned with insignias that marked them as higher-ranking officials. This new arrival wasted no time getting to the point. "Ms. Last name," they began, their voice crisp and authoritative. "Due to the nature of your actions, we'll need to detain you until further notice. You'll also face formal charges related to trespassing, disturbing public order, and interfering with law enforcement duties." Detained. Formal charges. The words echoed in Karen's ears, each one heavier than the last. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to break down completely. Instead, she nodded numbly, too overwhelmed to speak. As handcuffs were placed around her wrists, gently but firmly, the reality of her situation fully set in. This wasn't some minor scolding or slap on the wrist. This was serious, very serious, and as she was led out of the security booth and into a waiting vehicle, she couldn't help but wonder, what have I done? Outside, the crowd had grown larger, drawn by whispers of the commotion. Cameras flashed, capturing Karen's humiliated expression as she ducked her head and climbed into the car. For the tourists watching, it was a spectacle, a story to share over dinner. But for Karen, it was the beginning of a nightmare she never saw coming. The ride to the police station was silent, save for the hum of the car engine and the occasional crackle of the radio. Karen sat in the back seat, her hands still cuffed, staring blankly out the window as London's iconic streets rolled by. The city she had been so eager to explore now felt foreign and hostile, its beauty overshadowed by the weight of what had just happened. Her mind raced with questions. What would happen next? Would she go to jail? How would her family react when they found out? When the car finally pulled up to the station, Karen was escorted inside through a side entrance, away from prying eyes. The building was cold and sterile, with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. She was led to a small room where an officer handed her a cup of water and told her to sit tight while they processed her case. For a moment, she considered asking if she could call someone, her parents, maybe, or a friend. But the words caught in her throat. She didn't even know where to begin explaining this mess. It wasn't long before another officer entered the room, carrying a folder filled with papers. He introduced himself as Detective Harris and took a seat across from her. His demeanor was professional but not unkind, which gave Karen a flicker of hope. Maybe he'd understand that she hadn't meant any harm. "We need to talk about what happened today," he said, opening the folder. "But first, I want to make sure you understand the seriousness of your actions." Karen nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do. I think I do." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't realize it was such a big deal. Honestly, I thought it was just fun." Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Fun is one thing," he said, choosing his words deliberately. "But grabbing a Royal Guards rifle isn't just fun. It's a direct violation of protocol. Those guards are trained to protect the monarchy, and by extension, the country. Everything they carry, including their rifles, is part of that responsibility. When you touched it, You crossed a line." Karen swallowed hard, feeling the sting of his words. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but deep down, she knew he was right. She had acted without thinking, blinded by her own carelessness. Now she was paying the price. The detective continued, laying out the charges she faced: trespassing, disturbing public order, and interfering with law enforcement duties. Each charge sounded more severe than the last, and Karen's stomach churned at the thought of what they might mean for her future. "This isn't something we can ignore," Harris explained. "You'll likely face court proceedings, and depending on how things go, there could be fines, or worse." Worse. The word hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. Karen's mind flashed to images of jail cells and mugshots splashed across newspapers. Was that really where this was headed? She felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but blinked them away, determined not to cry in front of him. As the interrogation went on, Karen learned that her actions weren't just a personal mistake. They were being treated as a potential threat to national security. The rifle, whether loaded or not, symbolized the authority and protection of the crown. By touching it, she had inadvertently challenged that authority, setting off alarms that couldn't simply be brushed aside. Finally, after what felt like hours, Detective Harris closed the folder and stood up. "You're free to contact a lawyer," he said, his tone softening slightly. "They'll help you navigate the legal process. Until then, you'll remain here overnight while we decide on next steps." Overnight. The word hit Karen like a punch to the gut. Overnight in a holding cell. She couldn't imagine anything worse. As she was led to a small, dimly lit room with a cot and a sink, she sank onto the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of it made sense. Back home, news of Karen's arrest began spreading quickly. Friends who had been with her that day called her family, sharing bits and pieces of the story. Her parents were shocked, confused, and terrified all at once. They scrambled to find a lawyer, pooling resources to cover legal fees, while grappling with the shame of seeing their daughter's name tied to such reckless behavior. Meanwhile, video footage of the incident leaked online, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Some people mocked Karen, calling her entitled and clueless. Others defended her, arguing that she'd made a harmless mistake and shouldn't face such harsh consequences. Either way, the attention was relentless and overwhelming. Alone in her cell, Karen replayed the events of the day over and over in her mind, each memory sharper and more painful than the last. She realized now how foolish she'd been, how blind to the impact of her actions. The days following Karen's arrest were a blur of legal jargon, tense meetings, and sleepless nights. Her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Patel, wasted no time laying out the reality of her situation. "This is serious," she said during their first meeting in a small conference room at the police station. Papers were spread across the table, detailing the charges against Karen. "You're facing multiple counts: trespassing, disturbing public order, and interference with law enforcement duties. Depending on how the court rules, you could be looking at hefty fines or even jail time." Karen stared at the papers, her hands trembling as she tried to process the words. Jail time. The phrase felt surreal, like something out of a movie rather than her actual life. She had always thought of herself as a good person, someone who followed the rules, paid her taxes, and generally stayed out of trouble. How had it come to this? Ms. Patel leaned forward, her expression firm but not unkind. "The key here is showing remorse and taking responsibility for your actions. If we can demonstrate that this was a momentary lapse in judgment, not malicious intent, we might be able to negotiate reduced charges." She paused, letting her words sink in before adding, "But don't get your hopes up. The court takes breaches of protocol involving royal guards very seriously." Over the next few weeks, Karen attended multiple hearings, each one more nerve-wracking than the last. Courtrooms were intimidating places, filled with strangers whispering among themselves, lawyers arguing passionately, and judges whose faces revealed nothing. Every time her name was called, Karen felt her stomach drop. She hated being the center of attention under normal circumstances. Now, it was unbearable. During one particularly grueling session, the prosecution presented evidence that painted Karen's actions in the worst possible light. Security footage showed her laughing as she grabbed the rifle, striking playful poses while ignoring the guard's rigid stance. To Karen, it had seemed harmless at the time. A silly prank meant to entertain her friends, but on camera, it looked reckless and disrespectful. Even worse, headlines about the incident had gone viral online, turning her into a polarizing figure overnight. Some people defended her, claiming she'd made an innocent mistake and shouldn't face such severe consequences. Others condemned her behavior, accusing her of mocking tradition and putting others at risk. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags like #FreeKaren and #RespectTheGuard trending simultaneously. For Karen, reading these comments was both humiliating and exhausting. It felt like everyone had an opinion about her, none of which seemed to consider the person behind the headlines. The scared, overwhelmed woman sitting in a courtroom, trying to piece her life back together. Eventually, after weeks of negotiations and deliberations, the court handed down its decision. Karen avoided jail time, but was sentenced to several months of community service, along with a substantial fine. She was also required to write a formal apology letter to the Royal Guards and attend workshops on cultural sensitivity and responsible tourism. While relieved to avoid prison, Karen knew the punishment was still significant and deserved. Back home, the fallout continued. Friends who had once laughed alongside her during that fateful day at Buckingham Palace now kept their distance, unsure of what to say or how to act around her. At work, whispers followed her through the office hallways, and she found herself excluded from conversations she used to be part of. Even her family struggled to reconcile the carefree, adventurous Karen they knew with the woman now embroiled in scandal. Through it all, Karen couldn't escape the feeling that she'd let everyone down. Not just herself, but her loved ones too. Nights were the hardest. Lying awake in bed, she replayed the events over and over in her mind, wondering how things might have turned out differently if she'd simply walked away instead of reaching for that rifle. Yet, amid the chaos and shame, there was a glimmer of clarity. Karen began to see her actions for what they truly were: a disregard for boundaries, traditions, and the hard work of those tasked with protecting something greater than herself. For the first time in her life, she understood the weight of accountability and the importance of learning from her mistakes. The public fallout from Karen's actions was relentless, and it seemed like everywhere she turned, there was another reminder of the incident. News outlets ran stories analyzing her behavior, dissecting every detail of what had happened at Buckingham Palace. Social media became a battlefield, with debates raging about whether she deserved sympathy or condemnation. Memes mocking her began circulating online, turning her into both a punchline and a cautionary tale. Some commenters accused her of arrogance, while others defended her as someone who'd simply made a poor decision without understanding the consequences. For Karen, the constant scrutiny was suffocating. She deleted her social media accounts after seeing countless memes and cruel jokes about her arrest. Walking down the street felt like being under a microscope. She couldn't shake the feeling that people were whispering about her behind her back. Her once bright spirit dimmed as the weight of public judgment pressed down on her. The woman who had once thrived on adventure and spontaneity now avoided crowded places, dreading the possibility of recognition. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. As weeks turned into months, Karen started receiving messages, not insults this time, but thoughtful notes from strangers. Some shared their own stories of making mistakes and learning from them. Others expressed empathy, acknowledging that everyone has moments of poor judgment. These small acts of kindness reminded Karen that she wasn't entirely alone, that forgiveness, though rare, was still possible. Determined to reclaim some sense of control over her life, Karen decided to take responsibility in a way that went beyond court-mandated apologies and community service. She drafted an open letter addressed to the public, pouring her heart into every word. In it, she admitted her recklessness, apologized sincerely for her actions, and acknowledged the harm she had caused, not just to the royal guards, but to anyone who valued tradition and respect. "I let my impulsiveness overshadow my better judgment," she wrote. "What I did was wrong, and I deeply regret it." She posted the letter on a personal blog, unsure of how it would be received. To her surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Many readers praised her honesty and vulnerability, saying her words showed growth and maturity. For the first time since the incident, Karen felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this didn't have to define her forever. Encouraged by the support, Karen took another step forward, volunteering with organizations focused on promoting cultural sensitivity and responsible tourism. At first, she hesitated, worried about facing judgment from others involved in these programs. But as she began attending workshops and participating in discussions, she realized that many people genuinely wanted to help her learn and grow. Slowly, she found herself opening up, sharing her story not as an excuse, but as a lesson. One day, during a workshop led by a historian specializing in British traditions, Karen listened intently as the speaker explained the significance of the royal guards, not just as protectors of the monarchy, but as symbols of national pride and history. Hearing this perspective hit her hard. She thought back to that day at Buckingham Palace, when she'd seen the guards as little more than props in a tourist attraction. Now, she understood the depth of meaning behind their roles, and why her actions had been so offensive. Karen threw herself into the work, determined to turn her experience into something meaningful. She helped organize campaigns aimed at educating travelers about respecting local customs and laws. She even spoke at schools and community centers, sharing her story as a warning against carelessness and entitlement. It wasn't easy. Standing in front of audiences and reliving her lowest moment required courage, but Karen knew it was necessary. If her words could prevent someone else from making the same mistake, then perhaps all of this pain wouldn't have been in vain. As time passed, Karen noticed subtle changes within herself. The guilt and shame hadn't disappeared completely. They lingered like faint scars, but they no longer consumed her. Instead, she carried them as reminders of what she had learned, that actions have consequences, that boundaries exist for a reason, and that growth often comes from discomfort. While the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Karen finally felt like she was moving in the right direction, one step closer to becoming the person she wanted to be. Months had passed since the incident at Buckingham Palace, and Karen's life had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The scars of that day, the public humiliation, the legal battles, the strained relationships still lingered, but they no longer defined her. Instead, she had channeled the pain and lessons into something meaningful, emerging stronger and wiser on the other side. Karen's volunteer work with organizations promoting cultural sensitivity became a cornerstone of her new life. She traveled to schools, community centers, and even international conferences, sharing her story as both a cautionary tale and a message of redemption. Her talks were raw and honest. She didn't sugarcoat her mistakes or shy away from describing the consequences she faced. "I thought I was just having fun," she would say, standing before an audience. "But my actions weren't harmless. They were disrespectful, reckless, and hurtful. I learned the hard way that ignorance isn't an excuse." Her words resonated deeply with listeners, especially young people who often approached her after her presentations to ask questions or share their own struggles. Many told her how her story inspired them to think twice before acting impulsively or dismissing the importance of respecting boundaries. For Karen, these interactions were incredibly rewarding. They reminded her that her journey wasn't just about personal growth. It was also about helping others avoid similar pitfalls. Back home, Karen reconnected with old friends and family members, slowly rebuilding the trust she had damaged. It wasn't easy. Some wounds took longer to heal than others, but her sincerity and determination went a long way. Over coffee one afternoon, her best friend admitted, "It was hard to watch everything fall apart for you. But seeing how much you've grown, it makes me proud to call you my friend." Hearing those words brought tears to Karen's eyes. She knew she still had work to do, but moments like this reassured her that she was on the right path. Professionally, Karen found herself drawn to roles that allowed her to advocate for responsible tourism and cross-cultural understanding. She started writing articles and creating content aimed at educating travelers about the importance of respecting local customs and traditions. Her pieces gained traction online, earning praise from readers around the world. What began as a way to process her own experiences turned into a platform for positive change, a silver lining she hadn't anticipated. On quieter days, Karen reflected on how far she'd come. There were still moments when self-doubt crept in, when memories of that fateful day threatened to pull her back into shame. But instead of letting those feelings overwhelm her, she used them as fuel to keep moving forward. She kept a journal where she wrote down her thoughts, documenting not just her regrets, but also her victories, big and small. Each entry served as proof of her progress, a reminder that healing was possible. One crisp autumn morning, Karen returned to London, not as a tourist, but as someone eager to confront the place where it all began. Standing once again near Buckingham Palace, she felt a mix of emotions: sadness for what she had done, gratitude for the lessons she had learned, and hope for the future ahead. As she watched the royal guard standing tall and unwavering, she silently thanked them, not for punishing her, but for teaching her the value of respect and responsibility. Later that evening, sitting in a cozy cafe with a cup of tea, Karen smiled softly as she jotted notes for her next article. The title: "From Mistakes to Meaning: How One Moment Can Change Everything." Writing it felt cathartic, like closing a chapter while opening another. Though the memory of that day would always be part of her story, Karen no longer feared it. Instead, she embraced it as a turning point, a moment that forced her to grow, to listen, and to become someone better. And as she looked out the window at the bustling streets of London, she realized something profound. Life doesn't stop after a mistake. It evolves. And sometimes, if you're willing to face the truth and learn, it can lead you somewhere extraordinary.